There you are.
Hi, Stan.
Now,
how are you?
Now, I'm very well, Robert. You are, I understand, a Labor voter.
Yep.
But after the budget, you've got some questions about exactly what you voted for. Is that right?
I have, Stan. I've got some really serious questions that I think need to be answered, like tonight, if possible.
And okay, well, we've got someone to answer them. Katy's sitting right here. She's from the government. She's the finance minister. So away you go, Robert.
Right. Okay. Katy, I believe the overwhelming reason people turned to the ALP was that the middle class and the poor were tired of a government kicking the can down the road like it will be better this year or next year or the years to come, while corporate excesses were rife and people were going without. My question is, isn't this just a continuation under the new government of what we've had to put up with in the last 10 years? And where was the cost of living help that we needed on Tuesday night?
Katy.
Okay. So a couple of things there. I don't agree that it's just the same as what's been happening in the past. This budget, we tried to do three things. One was to deliver on our election commitments that we made before the last election, which we've done, was to provide sensible cost of living relief where we could without adding to the inflation problem that we're dealing with, particularly in the first 2 years of these forward estimates. And the third thing was to do a spending audit, which I was in charge of, which was to find some savings in the budget to start working towards some budget repair, which we also need to deal with for good reason, in the sense that we've got $1 trillion of debt, and managing that debt is the fastest growing program in the government budget.
And Katy, that's the government's dealing with that debt, it's dealing with its deficit, it's dealing with its budget bottom line, but so are families. And it was very clear from the Treasurer, and he said this very explicitly, that the indebted and the less well off are going to have to carry the heavy load. They're already paying more for their mortgages. They're going to have energy increases up to 50%. They're not going to get a pay rise in wage in line with inflation for another 18 months to 2 years. So it is a tough time ahead. And clearly people like Robert are saying there's not enough help.
Well, I think the difference that we're trying to deal with now, which is when we've looked at sort of some of the global uncertainty and some of the downturns we've had in the past, particularly the GFC, the COVID-19 pandemic, the response from government, and it was right to have it, was around providing stimulus to households. What we're dealing with at the moment, in the short term, certainly in the first 2 years, is this inflation challenge. So what we've had to do is look at what's the responsible thing to do. We've got the Reserve Bank increasing interest rates to try and temper inflation, bring it back down. What is the responsible thing? Where can the government meaningfully help? The first decision we took was that we needed to support the work of the Reserve Bank, not make the inflation inflation work and make worse and make the Reserve Bank's job harder. In which case, so we looked at cost of living, where can we make a difference? So we looked at things like childcare, things like PPL, things like investing in skills, things like getting on with the energy transformation.
None of those things, with respect, right now is going to help someone pay a mortgage when they're paying $800 more now on a $500,000 mortgage than they were paying a few months ago, when they're having to put fuel in the car, to deal with energy prices. All the things you're talking about are further down the line. Can I go to you, George, though?
Well, can I just finish by saying the worst thing the government could have done was indiscriminately splash around cash. Like, that is the worst thing. It's hard to say that because people are really feeling the pinch, and it's a different type of response that we've had to previous downturns, but we are dealing with a different set of problems, and the problem at the moment is inflation, and if we just chucked a whole lot of money out the door, we would add to that problem and make the problem worse, and that would hurt households further.
Explain this, George, because that can sound very harsh to people, saying, I know you're suffering under high inflation, but you're going to suffer because if we give you money, it's only going to make it worse. How can we have a situation, George, where the budget bottom line is improving and people's lives are going backwards?
The budget's obviously improved in the short run because of inflation. So inflation is adding to revenue. But when you have an inflation outbreak, and we haven't had one now this is the first one in 30 years, and there isn't anyone in the Parliament with a memory of the last inflation crisis. And Australia's inflation crisis began to bubble in the late 60s, and it popped out of the box with the oil shock in 73, brought down the Whitlam government in 75, and it ran all the way through the early 1990s, and it took us 10 years longer than everybody else to knock inflation off, to knock it on their head and to put it back in, put the genie back into the bottle.
And we remember at the time how people hurt at the time, how high it got.
Well, interest rates had to go to the point where it not just knocked off inflation, it brought on a deep recession. So the tricky thing now, so this is the thing that the Reserve Bank and the government, and I know that the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank governor talk to each other, and the Treasury Secretary is in that conversation as well. The least worst option for the government is a soft landing for the economy, that they go from 3% growth to 1.5% growth when the rest of the world crashes. And that is that, 1 is the new black, or 0 even is the new black, and we don't have a minus sign. But then if even with a slowdown you need inflation to come down, there's no guarantee that inflation comes down with a slowdown.
Well, in the budget they're saying it'll peak in December and start to come off. You don't necessarily think that's the case?
Like I say, if you look at the backstory, the last time we had an inflation crisis, which in a way was imported, like the Americans brought inflation onto the rest of the world because of they ran the Vietnam War on the credit card. It took us 20 years to get out of that trap. So in the short run, the Reserve Bank has to increase interest rates up until the point where it thinks it's a bit like chemotherapy, right? Up until the point at which you think you're not going to destroy the body. Like you're trying to knock off these cancers, but if you keep going, you're going to kill the patient. So that's the thing that they're trying to juggle at the moment. Now, in terms of what's on the kitchen table for people, in terms of the cost of living, the government has, and it sort of can't spell this out for you. I know Katy has sort of gone there, but can't take it to the nth degree, which is the pain has to be shared, because the worst thing we can do for you is to con you in the short term that this extra check is going to help you deal with inflation.
Hold that thought, George, because we're going to come back to a lot of this, and I want to bring you in, Sonia, because the point you made then is a relevant one. The pain has to be shared. In your view, is it being shared if the poorest and the most indebted are carrying the heaviest load?
Absolutely not, and we really see that in this budget. I think there are some cost of living, help for particular parts of society, and at Think Forward, I come to this from an intergenerational perspective. And I know, there's eligibility for the seniors' health card has changed. There's the freezing of the deeming rates, and of course, the pension is indexed to CPI. There's nothing for young people. There's nothing for rent assistance. There's nothing for youth allowance, for job seeker, the things that help young people, young working people, and those that are super vulnerable to adjust to the cost of living pressures. I don't see that. And then I see where there are budgetary helps for people, it's almost the same old story of politicians chasing the grey vote and not sending the money to where it actually needs to go, to people like Robert and his concerns.
We were going to go to Marcus Harrington a bit later, but you've raised young people. Marcus, are you here? Marcus Harrington. Can you stand up, Marcus? So how old are you, Marcus?
22.
22. You're working?
Yes, full-time.
When you looked at the budget and you hear what Sonia has to say, does that ring true to you as a young person?
Absolutely. Even before inflation, we already saw Medicare levies were at a higher threshold for older people. We saw, I believe, other forms of tax offset for older people. Older people are more likely to own their own home. They're more likely to own the investment properties that people my age are having to rent, and rents aren't being frozen or being, as Sonia pointed out, no extra assistance. So young people are feeling the pinch, and wage growth just isn't increasing in line with all that.
Katy?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the budget, there is actually one of the biggest increases in the budget, going to your point, was about $33 billion increase in payments, which does include payments for young people and for job seekers. So there was that adjustment, and a pretty significant adjustment at that. I think in other areas, I look at university places, I look at the investment in skills, I look at the housing accord. The first time for a long time that the Commonwealth has gone, you know what, we have a responsibility in housing, not just in signing off a deal with the states and territories on the housing and homelessness agreement, but actually being actively involved in affordable rental stock and coming to the table on that. Climate. I mean, there's it's actually more than $21 billion in investments in the transformation that's happening across our economy right now to get moving with that. Young people have a huge stake in that. So I don't accept that this budget was framed with a particular demographic in mind. It wasn't. It was set against a very challenging set of economic circumstances. I accept that, which meant that we had to show restraint and be very considered in the decisions we've taken. But within that, we have massive investments in climate, in housing, in
Katy,
skills, in university, in schools. I mean, these are the areas the Commonwealth can invest sensibly.
Absolutely, but I think it's really important that we see young people's issues as economic issues, and whether that's what Marcus was talking about in terms of rent assistance. The housing accord is great, but that might only wait till 2024. Me and a lot of my friends, we have landlords ringing us up and saying, we're increasing your rent by $100, and that's conservative. I've had some horror stories from mates of mine talking about the kinds of rent increases they're going to need over the next 12 months and what's in the budget for those people.
Well, again, I think, with the Commonwealth, where we pay for rent assistance, it is in the social housing sector. We don't subsidise rent outside of the social housing sector and public housing
also
sector.
Get rent assistance. So people on youth allowance aren't getting any extra support to adjust to the costs of living, and so they're not going to get any extra support with the rent assistance as well.
Well, I think the decision we've taken, the Commonwealth does provide support in rent assistance. We have a big increase in payments. We've got a big increase going out the door into community organisations to meet their costs. Many of those services are provided to young people in need. And then we have these other areas of the budget where we are making investments for the long term. I mean, we've come into government, we've had 5 months. We've put together a budget which is primarily around delivering election commitments, dealing with urgent and unforeseen things that happen, like Ukraine, COVID, floods, and cleaning up some of the legacy issues we were left by the previous government. So this budget should be seen as the first in a series of things. But we've had 9 years of neglect that we are having to deal with.